Sakura is a pretty cool character, isn't she? I mean, like, before she got hit with the bad writing stick and became a housewife. But wouldn't it be cool to have an action figure of her? So, SH Figuarts has released a bunch of pretty awesome Naruto figures, but they haven't released a Sakura, and they're rumored to be canceling the line. Surprisingly enough, there aren't actually any Sakura figures, or very few. Mattel never released one, SH Figuarts never released one, and while she does have an android, she doesn't have an actual action figure as a Figma. Honestly, the only thing that isn't an outright statue is the McFarlane Toys figure. They released two Naruto figures, one being the Naruto himself, which is a barely articulated statue that looks like it's suffering from a stroke, and the other Sakura, who's actually not terrible. Her likeness is spot on, and it doesn't look super weird the way anime figures often do. She's got decent articulation and paint, although all of her colors are just the tiniest bit off. The only problem is she's huge. The SH Figuart toys tend to be between 5 and 6 inches on a 1/12 scale, so a 6-foot man would be a 6-inch figure. Sakura, like most McFarlane toys, however, is on a 7-inch scale, so she looks massive next to anything that isn't like a wrestling figure or an NECA toy, which are also both on 7-inch scales. So I'm going to cut this figure down to a reasonable height so she doesn't loom too much over everyone else. If you want to get complicated about the math, the figure should be about 13.5 centimeters based on the fictional character's height. But I'm going to aim closer to 14 or 15 centimeters because there's only so much mass you can remove before the proportions start to look super wonky. Luckily, Sakura is an anime figure and she has these 50-mile-long legs, so I'm just going to remove mass from her legs, avoiding the joints, and pull her down to size. I'm also going to replace her skirt thing with fabric to retain posability, and because I very rarely like the look of plastic clothing. Let's begin. Sakura, luckily, is wearing boots and shorts, both of which will allow me to cut at a natural seam and disguise the area where the plastic is reconnected. The plastic this figure is made of is just oddly soft and rubbery, which is very easy to cut and doesn't stink when it's sanded, like certain types of hard plastic do. It also doesn't melt when it's sanded, which normal plastic does just due to the heat from friction. It's weird. I'm aiming to remove about a centimeter from both her thighs and her boots. That, along with her heels and some mass at her torso, should drop her height from 17 centimeters to about 14 centimeters. After I remove the stuff I don't want, it's time to glue the figure back together. I'm using epoxy glue with a wire base for added stability. All epoxy is basically two substances that, when mixed together, cure and harden. This epoxy just happens to be more liquidy than, say, epoxy sculpt, for instance, which I'm also going to be using. I resculpt her feet to be more flat-footed, on account of it's just extremely hard to jump through trees and pumps. As a note, always wear gloves when working with epoxy sculpt, and when sanding epoxy sculpt, wear a face mask. Afterwards, I'm using my Dremel to sand everything smooth. I like to wet sand, where basically you dip both the action figure and your sanding material into water. This cuts down on the amount of dust that gets kicked up. I made her skirt from a white knit fabric. Now I don't have the right color, so I'm just going to dye it with ink. Ink doesn't permanently dye fabric, it just stains it, so it won't work for clothing that you'll actually wear, but it'll work for an action figure because they don't walk around or wash it. A note about fabric. Because 1/12 figures are so small, you'll need to be very mindful of the way that fabric drapes. It can be tempting to use something like vinyl or leather in order to get the right texture, but it's never going to look right on the figure because it's too thick. The pattern for her skirt is very much a BS, and I've just basically guessed at it. I glued wire onto the edges of the skirt so the fabric can be posed, which makes it look more to scale than just letting it hang. Alright, here she is completed. You can see now she's more to scale with the SH Figuarts toys, although her head is slightly large and she's still a little bit too tall to be perfectly proportional, but whatever, maybe Sakura's just tall. It's the heels that are invisible. Alright, thanks for watching.